You may have seen posts like this and like this raving on UFC fighter pay. Hell, you may have also seen the likes of even Jake Paul constantly berating the likes of Dana White and the UFC about UFC fighter pay. Having two brothers that are both MMA fighters and being a boxer myself made me really want to understand UFC fighter pay and really get to know and learn how much these fighters are actually making, especially for most of the casual fans out there. They are probably unaware. They've probably seen all these people talking about it and they've seen all these types of posts and they're just kind of running away with it and just kind of saying that they need to pay fighters more without actually knowing what these fighters make. So in this video, we're going to break down what UFC contracts look like from the top biggest fighters we all know and love all the way down to the bottom UFC debut fighters that no one has ever heard or seen before. With all the details and the research I'm about to provide to all of you guys can inform your own opinions on UFC fighter pay, if these guys are making a good amount of money, should be making a little bit more money, or if the UFC is completely screwing these fighters over. And let me know your thoughts and opinions in the comments down below. I just want to give a little quick disclaimer. Of course, I'm not going to be adding in any fees that may be taking out of their fighter pay, such as like taxes, what percentage their coach might take from them for being a cornerman of the fight, because that type of deduction may vary depending on the coach. There's also travel fees and many other things like this, so all that stuff will not be taken into account, which is also news to me. There is a UFC fighter health insurance plan. However, they split the bill. The UFC doesn't cover the whole bill, which can actually be a whole topic in and of itself. So if you're interested in this type of topic, let me know in the comments down below and I can make a whole separate video on it, because there's a lot to talk about this whole situation too. But without further ado, let's get into it. So I figured rather than starting at the big top dogs that we all know and are familiar with, we should start all the way at the bottom with the guys we have never seen, have never heard of, and have come out of nowhere, most likely probably come from other countries or other parts of the world where there people in the States aren't familiar with any of these guys, because these are the type of guys that are more so likely going to get the absolute bottom barrel of a UFC contract. No one knows who they are. They're likely fighting in the United States for the very first time. You get the call, Dana White, Hunter Campbell, Sean Shelby, whoever, they got to fight for you in the UFC. You've made it. You've officially made it to the big time promotion that can quite possibly change your entire life. So what is that first contract going to look like when they send it your way? Well, when you are officially a UFC fighter and you sign with the UFC, you get a show bonus. So you get a certain amount of money to show up to fight. You get a win bonus, so you get an extra amount of money to win the fight, and you get a couple other bonuses, which we will talk about very shortly. So the lowest level contract for someone making their UFC debut that I can find is a 10 and 10 contract. So you will get $10,000 to show up and fight, and if you win that fight, you will get another $10,000 on top of that. However, I have seen that Chael Sonnen did say that the fighter pay minimum has been increased to 12 and 12, so 12,000 to fight, 12,000 on top of that to win. So I'm pretty positive it is somewhere in that range. Now you put on an amazing fight, maybe you get fight of the night, maybe you get a crazy sick knockout, or maybe some wild submission no one has ever seen before, you get a bonus of $50,000. But wait, there's actually more. So actually just from wearing your Venom fight kit, you get an additional $4,000. So assuming in your UFC debut, everything possible goes right, you walk away, quote unquote, and I say that because of all the deductions, but you will have officially earned $74,000. Now, will you walk away with that amount of money? Definitely not. But that is the money you will have earned for that one fight. And hey man, at first glance, $74,000, that might seem like a good amount of money for just one fight. However, if things don't really quite go your way, that's when you start to see this number dip down big time. Say you just win a unanimous decision, that number drops all the way down to $24,000. Now say something happens and you don't even win the fight, now it drops down to $14,000. And remember, that does not count all of the taxes and fees that go along with it. So your UFC debut can be very, very profitable and can absolutely change your life. You can make a good amount of money, but it can also hurt you really, really bad financially. But if you continue to be successful in the UFC, your pockets will only get deeper and the purses will only get bigger. And if you're like me, you often wonder, man, I miss those days when Nick Diaz used to walk out in Metal Militia hoodie and some jeans. Why does every fighter now always walk out in the same exact Venom fight gear? Well, the answer to that will be because they are getting paid to do so, and they're actually getting paid a pretty decent amount. Venom has been very open with their payment plans on fighters who abide by their policy and wear their gear, which is why you see every fighter wearing this fight gear into the octagon because it's basically free money. All you gotta do is wear the clothes, walk to the octagon with it, you get paid even more money. Just to break it down for you, a fighter with 1 to 3 fights in the UFC, you get paid $4,000. 4 to 5 fights, you get paid $4,500. 6 to 10 fights, you get paid $6,000. 11 to 15 fights, you get paid $11,000. 6 to 20 fights, you get paid $16,000. 21 or more fights, you get paid $21,000. Any title challengers, you make $32,000. And any champions, you make $42,000. So that's a pretty nice bonus just to literally walk to the octagon in some Venom clothing. And if you're a popular fighter out there, you also get 20 to 30% royalty payments for any UFC merch that is sold with your likeness. So if you have a successful run in the UFC with your show money, your win money, maybe you get some performance bonuses, your Venom fight kit bonus, and if you are well known and you sell a decent amount of merch, you're making a pretty decent amount of money. But like I said, you have to be successful because as we talked before, if you're not successful, you lose your first 2 fights. You probably only make not even $30,000 in 2 fights in the UFC over a span of 6 or so months. But now that we have talked a little bit about the lower level fighters, let's talk about those upper level fighters. So if you're a popular fighter, you're maybe not a title holder, so you're not getting those pay-per-view points, but you're very popular. You could be like a Justin Gaethje. These guys make well into 6 figures a fight. But like I said, they are fan favorite fighters, so who really knows how much merch they are selling and how much money and royalties they are making off of the amount of merch that they sell. Of course, UFC champions and also some of the bigger name fighters out there, notably like a Jorge Masvidal or like a Nate Diaz, they do get pay-per-view points for headlining big time cards, which if you're unaware with how the pay-per-view point system works, of course, how many pay-per-view points you actually earn from contract to contract, it varies depending on how big of a fighter you are. But Eddie Alvarez's contract actually was released showing how many pay-per-view points he got. So according to the terms of the deal with Eddie Alvarez, he got $1 for each pay-per-view buy that was between 200,000 and 400,000 buys. He got $2 for every pay-per-view buy that was between 400,000 and 600,000 buys, and he got $2.50 for every pay-per-view buy that was over 600,000 buys. So if he had a title fight that got 1 million pay-per-view buys, like say the fight he had with Conor McGregor, he would gain around $1.6 million just in pay-per-view points. All right, now I'm going to talk about the biggest of the biggest, the top dogs, some of the fighters who have made the most money in UFC history. So I was able to find a lawsuit that the UFC was in, and due to this lawsuit, they actually had to put out and release a lot of big time fighters' pay for certain fights. The likes of Conor McGregor for his fight with Eddie Alvarez to be the 2-time champion made $6,812,374. However, since then, he has been reported to make around 8 to 10 million per fight. And of course, with some being over 20 million, most likely will be that Khabib Nurmagomedov fight. Ronda Rousey, her biggest payday was her fight against Amanda Nunes. She made $4,879,766. And John Jones, at the time, his biggest payday was the first fight against Daniel Cormier, in which he made $3,637,500, which I'm sure he has made a lot more since then, most likely from the second Daniel Cormier fight, which was huge, and also from his most recent fight against Cyril Gane. One of those two was probably his biggest payday by far. So you can see the top dogs in the UFC, they are making a good amount of money, and if you do a little bit of research also, they are making boxing money. Gervonta Davis, one of the faces of boxing, in his most popular and biggest fight of his career against Ryan Garcia, he made $5 million. So you can see even the biggest names in boxing, they make around the same as the biggest names in the UFC. Of course, the outliers like Canelo Alvarez and Floyd Mayweather are making more than anybody ever, but the business of boxing is completely different than the UFC. But before I get into that, of course, the most recent viral thing that has been blowing up is the picture showing that Mike Perry has made practically just as much in that one BKFC fight as he has his entire career in the UFC. But what I think one of the biggest misconceptions is the fact that, Mike Perry is the face of the BKFC. If you want to do a comparison, you need to compare Mike Perry as the face of the BKFC to who is the face of the UFC and compare those earnings. He was very much in the middle of the pack in the UFC. He was reportedly making 6 figures, but more so in that like $80,000 to $90,000 range. So I just don't think it's fair to really compare those contracts when he was, in the middle of the pack in the UFC, and now he's the face of the BKFC. So of course he's going to be getting paid more. It's only right to compare him to the likes of Conor McGregor, someone like a Ronda Rousey, someone like a John Jones, because these are some of the people who were and are the faces of the UFC. But back to the boxing and MMA comparisons, because people really like to look at how much boxers make, such as Floyd Mayweather and Canelo Alvarez. When Tyson Fury got paid, like $40 million to fight Deontay Wilder. People like to look at these and compare them to the big UFC fights and see how the bigger UFC fights, they're more so making 7 figures, whereas the big time boxing fights, they're making 8 figures. But what they fail to take into account is that the contracts and the negotiations are completely different in these sports. Professional boxers are paid on a fight-by-fight basis, meaning that when you go into every fight, there are negotiations for each fight. Whereas in the UFC, you have negotiations for a bunch of fights. They put you on a multi-fight contract, no matter how big you are. Even Conor McGregor is on a multi-fight contract. Because at the end of the day, it is a business. So you really just need to put yourself in the best position possible for negotiating purposes. A good indicator of this would be Sean O'Malley. A lot of people ridiculed him for this, but he did it for financial reasons. He refused to go and fight higher competition when the UFC wasn't paying him quite the amount of money he was wanting. So instead of complaining, what he did was he said, all right, I'm gonna stick at this lower level to help boost my popularity and my stardom, so then the UFC will value me more. So then when I go to fight the upper tier of fighters in the UFC and the actual ranked fighters, then he has more negotiation power in requesting more money for the bigger fights. Which if you're a fairly popular guy like Sean O'Malley is, you can make those kinds of demands. Which is funny because when Sean O'Malley was coming out about how, he's not going to fight higher in the rankings, he's going to continue to fight where he's fighting because the UFC is paying him a certain amount of money, so he feels like he shouldn't be getting paid that amount of money to fight the top guys in the world. People kind of shit on him for it. But then at the same time, they complain about UFC fight money, so it doesn't really make that much sense. And like I said, you can't compare boxing to MMA. In the UFC, we get the fights we want to see. We know who the number 1 fighter in the world is at each weight class. And if there's an interim champion, then that gets settled immediately with them unifying. Whereas in boxing, now that they've paid these fighters so much amount of money, I think Eddie Alvarez really summed it up well in this statement here. He says it's counterintuitive to pay fighters large purses because they become less cooperative and more independent. The business works perfect when everyone is broke and begging to fight at the drop of a hat. Cooperation is key. Large purses disrupt their own business. And this is very, very true. Yeah, most of the fighters, they might not be absolutely broke, especially if they're smart with their finances. Most fighters have to fight multiple times a year. If you begin to throw money at these fighters and start paying them crazy purses, you see the issue that we have in boxing. And if they're making millions of dollars fighting Joe Schmo, why are they going to go risk that and go fight one of the top dogs out there when they can make plenty of money fighting these lower level guys who are not on their level and just stack up millions upon millions of dollars taking these easier fights? Boxing is a really clear indication to what happens when you pay your fighters a little bit too generously. So you can keep this all in mind when thinking about your opinion on if the UFC is paying their fighters too less, or if you believe the UFC fighter pay is paying them just the right amount, or maybe you believe they should pay them just a little bit more. They don't have to go overboard and pay their fighters too much like boxing, but they can afford to pay them a little bit more to make their lives easier. If any of you wanted to know my opinion, I just think fighting is a sales job. I think how well you market yourself and how profitable you are, the more money you make. So ultimately, as the fighter, it's up to you to sell yourself as best as possible, so then when it comes to contract negotiations, you have more of a leg in the race and have a better chance of getting what you feel you deserve. But if you really want to get into the comparisons on UFC fighter pay and boxing fighter pay, former bronze medalist and undefeated professional fighter Tony Jeffries actually has a video detailing how much money he made as a professional boxer that I encourage you to go check out. I'll leave the link to it down in the description below. Of course, let me know your opinions in the comments down below. As always, I thank you all so much for your support, and I'll catch you in the next video.